If a well-dressed black man steps out of the airport after a business trip and is stopped, questioned, and then slammed to the ground by police in front of a crowd, what would you think? If he remains calm, clearly states his civil rights, but still ends up in handcuffs just for demanding respect, would anyone stand with him? And what if I told you that this man was the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation? Then the bigger question is, what would have happened if he didn't hold that title? Would justice still come? Or would it vanish into silence like so many times before? This wasn't just a wrongful arrest. This was a test for the entire system when faced with a man who refused to bow his head. United Flight 1436 touched down on runway 2 at Rosebridge International Airport late Saturday afternoon. Through the misted glass window, the evening sun cast a soft glow across the slowly fading turbine blades. In the business class cabin, Malcolm Hayes unbuckled his seatbelt and sat still for one extra breath before standing. It was a ritual, a moment of pause between a long flight and the first steps back into the real world. At 56, Malcolm still carried the lean, upright frame of a former federal agent, a charcoal gray suit, modest but perfectly tailored. A navy tie loosened slightly after 4 hours flying from Washington, D.C. He traveled light, just a slim leather briefcase and a black carry-on. No security detail, no priority tags, no flashy titles or badges. He always moved like an ordinary man, which made him an easy target, no matter where he was. Exiting the aircraft, Malcolm blended into the flow of passengers making their way toward the connecting gates. His expression remained calm, eyes scanning with constant awareness. Not tense, just observant, a habit honed from decades in federal investigations. He took in every stray glance, noted every suspicious gesture, every intentional or accidental bump. For him, airports were always places of heightened alert. Not far from Gate 27, 2 airport security officers were making their patrol rounds. Richard Calloway, white, early 50s, face hardened by years of bitterness and entitlement, leaned against a column, eyes sweeping the crowd. Beside him stood Mason Miller, younger, less assured in posture, but clearly high on the illusion of authority draped over his shoulders. Calloway's shoulder radio crackled briefly, then fell silent, before displaying a simple message. Suspicious individual, black male, dark clothing, alone, tense expression. That was it. No specific behavior, no clear reason. Just a vague alert, yet enough to make Calloway smirk, scan the crowd, and zero in. Malcolm Hayes, the only black man in a suit among rows of transit passengers, walking with quiet confidence and sharp eyes. "That's our guy," Calloway muttered, nudging Miller. "Fits the description perfectly. You see it?" Miller hesitated. "He looks pretty respectable, actually." Calloway sneered. "The clever ones are the most dangerous. Let's go." "Stop right there." Calloway's voice barked from behind, rough, abrupt, devoid of courtesy. Malcolm turned, showing no surprise, just a faint trace of weariness across his brow. "Is there a problem, officers?" His voice was low, clear, not submissive, not confrontational. Calloway stepped in closer than necessary. "We received a report of a suspicious individual. You match the description. Show your ID." Malcolm tilted his head slightly, one foot anchored firmly. "I'm sorry, but what specifically am I being suspected of? By law, you need a valid reason to request identification. Polite, but not pliable." Calloway narrowed his eyes. He didn't like black men who knew their rights, least of all ones who dared invoke them. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," he growled. "We have the authority to question anyone in this airport." Malcolm held his gaze, not defiantly, but with complete self-awareness. "I haven't done anything wrong, and your approach frankly seems to exceed your legal boundaries." A gentle reminder, a statement made with intelligence. And in that instant, to Calloway, Malcolm Hayes ceased to be a passenger. He became someone who needs to be put in his place. And from that moment on, this was no longer just a routine check. It became a confrontation where prejudice wore a badge and reason began to be mistaken for defiance. The story was just beginning. Malcolm Hayes reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and slowly pulled out his wallet, with the same care one might use to avoid spilling a fine glass of wine on a thin tablecloth. He held out his ID card between 2 fingers, no wasted motion, no furrowed brow. Officer Richard Calloway snatched the card like it was something filthy, his eyes scanning the address, Virginia. His lip curled just enough to form a smirk of disdain. "Virginia, huh?" he repeated, as if the state alone was cause for suspicion. "Came a long way, wearing a suit, dragging a suitcase? I bet it's not for golf." Malcolm didn't react. He'd heard this kind of insinuation before, from high-level boardrooms to low-level checkpoints. But what made it different now was where those words were coming from, beneath the badge of the law. Officer Mason Miller stood slightly behind, his expression uncertain, but he didn't intervene. He didn't chime in, but his silence was enough to allow Calloway's words to go unchallenged. "So," Calloway growled, "what kind of job brings a man like you here, dressed like you're headed to a UN Security Council meeting?" Malcolm inhaled deeply. "I'm here on business," he replied succinctly. "And I believe my reason for traveling is not something you're entitled to investigate unless you have specific evidence that I've violated something. Polite, restrained." Not defiant, but in Calloway's ears it landed as an insult. He hated smart black men, the kind who didn't flinch in the face of a uniform. His eyes gleamed with contempt. "All right then, Mr. Business Trip," he mocked the phrase like a joke. "So what's in the suitcase? Classified documents? Or the kind of thing guys like you carry to make a few trades?" Malcolm raised an eyebrow. He didn't need to ask to understand what had just been implied. No formal accusation, yet clear in tone, in the way Calloway said, guys like you don't go on business trips. Guys like you don't carry documents. Guys like you must be criminals. You're implying I'm carrying contraband?" Malcolm's voice remained steady, but a chill flickered in his gaze. Calloway stepped in closer, deliberately imposing. "I'm implying what experience tells me to believe. The way you walk, the way you dress, that tension in your face, it all says something's not right." "Tension?" Malcolm repeated, his lips curving slightly. "You think a black man stopped by 2 white officers in an airport for no reason should be all smiles and relaxed?" Miller shifted slightly, as if to say something, but a look from Calloway stopped him cold. The air was beginning to thicken. Malcolm stood tall, refusing to yield a single step. "Listen here," Calloway hissed. "We don't need lectures. We have the right to question, inspect, and detain anyone showing suspicious behavior." "Suspicious behavior?" Malcolm asked. "Or is it just my skin and calm demeanor that bother you?" A long pause followed. Under the sterile glow of the transit checkpoint's fluorescent lights, that line landed like a slap, not loud, not angry, but too accurate to deny. Calloway's hand tightened around the strap of his holster. He was used to asking the questions, not being met with sharp, articulate pushback. And in his eyes, Malcolm Hayes, a composed, articulate black man who refused to bow, was no longer just a passenger. He was now someone who needed to be put back in place. And at that moment, insult was legalized by the silver badge pinned to a uniform. Malcolm Hayes stood still, eyes locked on Officer Calloway. There was no fear in his gaze, only dignity, the kind he had spent a lifetime preserving in a world that constantly demanded he justify his very existence. "You're crossing the line," he said, articulating every word clearly. "I've presented my ID. I am not obligated to answer discriminatory questions. Without specific legal grounds, I request to proceed." His voice wasn't raised, but it echoed like a declaration, neither asking for permission nor apologizing. Calloway gripped his holster tighter, his eyes aflame. "Who do you think you are, talking to the police like that?" "I think I'm a citizen entitled to fair treatment," Malcolm responded calmly. In that moment, the older officer seemed to lose all composure. He stepped forward, reaching out as if to grab Malcolm's arm. Malcolm instinctively leaned away, a reflexive movement, not resistance. But to someone eager to twist every gesture into justification for authority, even a subtle move was enough to shift the entire narrative. "See that? He's resisting," Calloway barked, whipping around to signal Miller. "Restrain him. Could be armed." Miller hesitated for just a second. But in that second, he didn't hear reason, he heard his superior. And the fear of a rookie still new to the badge made him act as though stopping a real threat. He lunged forward, grabbing Malcolm's right arm. "Don't touch me!" Malcolm's voice rang out, not in fear, but because a boundary had been crossed. He pushed Miller's arm away, not striking, not attacking, just a defensive motion. But in that instant, everything slipped beyond control. Calloway charged in from behind. Both uniformed men shoved Malcolm forward at once. A forceful jab to the back, a yank at the shoulder. And there, in full view of dozens of stunned onlookers at Rosebridge Airport's terminal, a well-dressed black man on a business trip was slammed to the ground. His suitcase tumbled from his hand, the leather briefcase flung open, documents scattering across the tile floor like falling leaves. Miller pulled out a pair of gleaming handcuffs from his belt. While Calloway pinned Malcolm's shoulder down, the younger officer yanked his wrists behind him and locked the cuffs with a practiced but unnecessarily rough motion. The cold metallic clink echoed through the hall, halting footsteps. "You're under arrest for obstructing a law enforcement officer," Calloway declared triumphantly. "Keep acting tough and see where it gets you." Malcolm lay on his side, his forehead lightly touching the tile. He didn't cry out, didn't beg. He just closed his eyes for a second and inhaled deeply. There was no fear in him, only anger, a quiet, controlled fury, shaped by silence. Not because he couldn't fight back, but because he knew exactly what would happen if he did. Around them, a few passengers had pulled out their phones. They didn't know the whole story, but they had seen one thing clearly. The man on the floor wasn't carrying a weapon. He carried only his calm, and that alone had gotten him knocked down. The two officers stood. Malcolm was hauled up from the floor, hands bound behind him, his suit jacket rumpled, one collar torn. And yet, when his eyes opened again, there was no submission in them. He didn't know who was filming, but he knew. This time, the truth wouldn't just live in memory. It was beginning to be recorded. Malcolm Hayes was pulled upright, hands still cuffed tightly behind his back, suit shoulder rumpled, wrists bruised and red. His breathing was steady, his gaze unwavering. Surrounded by curious stares and uncomfortable silence, he refused to let himself fall into the role of a victim. No slumped shoulders, no bowed head. Officer Richard Calloway, on the other hand, looked like he'd just won an invisible battle, eyes gleaming with arrogance and satisfaction. He bent down to pick up Malcolm's leather wallet, pulled out the ID card, glanced at it, and let out a small, contemptuous chuckle. "Malcolm Hayes," he repeated, emphasizing the name with disdain. "Sounds powerful. What are you supposed to be? A lawyer? A politician? Or just another guy who likes preaching to cops?" Miller stood beside him in silence, sweat forming at his brow. His eyes darted between Calloway, Malcolm, and the smartphones now discreetly recording everything. Calloway pressed on, now almost deliberately degrading. "You like talking about rights? What rights? You're under arrest for resisting orders. Simple. I write the report here. And you? You go down as a non-compliant suspect." Malcolm turned his head, eyes locking directly onto Calloway's, not with challenge, not with anger, but with a finality. He spoke slowly, enunciating every word. "I am the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I oversee all FBI agents nationwide, including investigations into law enforcement abuse of power." Silence. Not a single breath. Calloway froze. His hand still held the ID card, but now it trembled slightly. The triumphant expression vanished, replaced by a look of stunned confusion, like a man who had shoved someone in the dark, only to flip on the lights and find out that person was his highest superior. Miller stepped back half a pace. His eyes widened, his lips parted as if to ask something, but no words came. He looked to Calloway, hoping he would say something, a correction, an explanation, but the older officer just stood still, as if paralyzed. Then Malcolm's words began to fall, each one like a hammer hitting stone. "I don't need to shout to be heard. I don't need to prove that I deserve respect. But when the truth is exposed, no one will be able to deny what they've done." Around them, no one spoke. Passers-by had stopped. Phones that were once recording discreetly were now live streaming. They didn't know the full story, but they knew something monumental had just occurred. And no internal report could hide it now. Calloway opened his mouth, but no words came out. His face paled. Panic flickered in his eyes. "You're saying you're FBI?" he stammered. "Not just an agent," Malcolm replied. "I'm the director." Miller took another step back. His hand dropped from his holster, as if remembering that weapon was no longer a symbol of authority, but now a piece of evidence in a criminal act. For a few seconds, the entire terminal at Rosebridge Airport fell into a soundless void. A black man, thrown to the floor at an airport, handcuffed for non-compliance, had just revealed himself as the man with the power to investigate the very system that had produced the two officers standing before him. And in that moment, everything shifted, not with a gunshot, not with violence, but with a name, a title, and a truth that could no longer be denied. The air in Rosebridge Airport's connecting terminal had thickened like a storm was about to break. Whispered conversations died out. Curious and skeptical eyes turned toward an unexpected scene. A middle-aged black man, hands cuffed, suit disheveled, had just declared himself the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation right in front of the two officers who had thrown him to the ground. No one knew what would happen next, but everyone understood one thing: this moment would not end in silence. And then, a third voice rang out, firm, low, and commanding. "What the hell is going on here?" Lieutenant Samuel Briggs, head of internal airport security at Rosebridge, strode swiftly toward the scene. He was in his early 40s, tall, close-cropped hair, with the sharp gaze of a military investigator. 2 other officers followed, ready to intervene if necessary. Briggs scanned the scene, his eyes capturing every detail like a mental photograph. The toppled suitcase, scattered documents, the opened briefcase, 2 officers frozen like statues, and a handcuffed man who, despite everything, still carried an air of unshakable dignity. It didn't take Briggs long to sense the gravity of the situation. "Calloway, Miller," he said, his voice deepening. "Explain. Who gave the order to cuff this man?" Calloway swallowed hard, stepping forward with a stammer. "Lieutenant, there was a report, a description. We suspected this individual might, specifically what behavior?" Briggs cut him off, eyes locked on Malcolm. "I want a factual account, not a string of guesses." Miller opened his mouth but stayed silent as Briggs turned to Malcolm, speaking slowly and with respect. "Sir, I'm Lieutenant Samuel Briggs, officer in charge of today's shift here at Rosebridge. May I ask, who are you?" Malcolm lifted his head, though his wrists remained cuffed. "I'm Malcolm Hayes, director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I just arrived from D.C. and was stopped by these officers without any legal basis. They refused to answer questions, insulted me, shoved me, and cuffed me despite me making no threatening move whatsoever." Briggs listened without changing expression, but his lips pressed tightly together. "You two," he turned to Calloway and Miller. "Disarm, remove your badges, and surrender your radios immediately." "Lieutenant, please. Calloway tried to object. "Immediately," Briggs repeated, voice low but steel cold. "That's a direct order. I don't repeat myself a 3rd time." The 2 officers froze for a moment, then reluctantly unfastened their gun belts and peeled the badges off their uniforms. Miller looked pale, silent. Calloway flushed deep red, jaw clenched, but complied nonetheless. Briggs signaled to an escorting officer, "Secure all footage from both of their body cams. Send copies directly to Internal Affairs and notify the FBI Coordination Office within 15 minutes." He stepped toward Malcolm, nodding slightly, not overly deferential, but just enough to mark a shift in tone and respect. "Director Hayes, I offer my sincere apologies on behalf of our team here. I will personally ensure this investigation proceeds transparently, no shortcuts, no excuses." Malcolm nodded, voice low. "I'm not here for an apology, Lieutenant. I'm here to make sure this system understands wearing a uniform isn't a license to humiliate." Briggs didn't reply, but his gaze met Malcolm's long enough to carry the weight of a silent promise. The 2 officers were escorted out of the terminal. A few travelers began to clap quietly, not out of schadenfreude, but because they had just witnessed something rare, true authority standing on the side of truth without shouting, without drawing a weapon. And for the first time since it all began, Malcolm Hayes was uncuffed. But he knew, what needed to be unlocked wasn't around his wrists. It was embedded in the mindset of an entire system. Sentencing day. The sky above the Eastern District Federal Courthouse was a heavy gray, though no rain fell. Citizens lined up along the white stone colonnade, waiting for a seat in the trial the entire country was watching. Not because the names Richard Calloway and Mason Miller had become famous, but because their case had become a test of conscience for the American legal system. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere wasn't as tense as on argument day, but neither was it comfortable. Everyone knew that today was no longer about words or evidence, it was about accountability and consequence. The 2 defendants were led into the courtroom, their faces drawn and hollow. Officer Calloway no longer bore the arrogant posture he once had at Rosebridge Airport. The coldness in his eyes had faded, replaced by what looked like the last layer of self-defense. Beside him, Miller sat with his head bowed, hands clenched, back hunched like a schoolboy dreading his turn at the blackboard just before a report card is torn in half. Federal Judge Eleanor Whitford entered, her black robe seeming to drain all sound from the room. Known for being stern but fair, today all eyes turned to her as if every word she was about to utter would determine not only the fate of the 2 men before her, but a national statement on the state of American justice. She read the sentence in a calm, unfaltering tone. No embellishment, but every word firm as steel. The court sentences Richard Calloway and Mason Miller to 6 years each in federal custody for the crimes of violating civil rights, unjustified assault, and abuse of authority while acting under the color of law. A few whispers rippled through the courtroom, then silence. No applause, no celebration. Because here, this wasn't a victory. This was consequence. Judge Whitford paused, then looked up, her gaze sweeping across each face in the room. Justice is not a uniform, it is not a badge, and it is certainly not unchecked power. When those entrusted to protect the public use that very power to humiliate, degrade, and harm, the system does not merely fail one person. It betrays the trust of an entire society. She continued, racial bias in public service is an existential threat to democracy. It does not merely wound the individual, it corrodes the very trust upon which our legal institutions depend. On the plaintiff's side, Malcolm Hayes sat quietly, hands folded. When he heard the sentence, he gave a slight nod, not of satisfaction, not of joy. Just a small, slow nod, as if to confirm, justice, at last, had arrived, even if late and painful. Reporters waited outside the courthouse, but as Malcolm walked out with his attorney, he gave no statements, no press conference, no speeches on behalf of others. He simply said to an elderly woman waiting by the gate, "I don't ask for much, just that those in uniform understand what they stand for." And then he walked away without looking back. In that moment, people did not see a high-ranking official emerging victorious from a courtroom. They saw a citizen who had proven that the truth, when protected at all costs, can still accomplish what the system too often forgets to do. End of day. As the day drew to a close, the last pale sunlight slid through the glass-paneled towers of FBI headquarters in the Capitol. In the office on the top floor, Malcolm Hayes stood silently before the window, eyes fixed on the stream of cars snaking down Pennsylvania Avenue. Beneath his feet lay the most powerful agency in the country. But in his heart, only one question repeated itself, small but persistent, like a wound that refused to heal. If I weren't the director of the FBI, who would have believed me? That question wasn't about himself. It was a brutal test for a system he had once fully trusted. A system that had granted him a title, authority, and respect, but only protected him once someone realized the business card in his wallet bore the words, Federal Bureau of Investigation. He remembered Calloway's eyes back when he still believed Malcolm was just a black man in a suit. The way his tone shifted after hearing 3 words, I'm the director. The fear didn't come from guilt. It came from consequence, from status, not from principle. And that realization chilled Malcolm to the core, because if that day, the man backed against the wall had not been him, but an ordinary black man, with no title, no camera, no live stream, then what? Would anyone have removed his handcuffs? Would anyone have ordered the body cam footage sealed? Would anyone have said, I apologize on behalf of the system? Probably not. And that's what made the 6-year sentence, even at its harshest, only a small piece of a far larger structure, where justice still selectively decides who it protects. Malcolm stepped toward his desk, where a stack of folders awaited him. A few internal investigation reports, a petition from the Office of Civil Rights Oversight, an invitation to speak from the National Alliance for Law Enforcement Reform. But he didn't sign anything right away. Instead, he pulled out a blank sheet of paper. No logo, no letterhead, just a few lines he wrote to himself. Truth doesn't come from rank, it comes from resolve. A title might make people listen, but only conviction makes them believe. That's what he had learned from that fateful encounter, not about position, but about the true value of a person once every outer layer is stripped away. And he knew that if he truly wanted to change anything, it wouldn't begin with directives from an office. It would begin with action on the ground, among ordinary people. Because systems don't change from the top down. They change the moment one person, just one, stands up for what's right, even when no one calls their name. Malcolm tucked the paper into the folder he carried with him. A private copy of a promise not for the world but for himself. He didn't need the nation to remember his name. What he needed was for the day to come when no one would have to shout, I'm the director, just to be treated with dignity. Truth doesn't need a badge to stand. It only needs one person who won't give up to keep telling it until justice stops being selective. 1 month after the historic trial, there was no celebration, no medals of honor, and no grand speeches before the press. Malcolm Hayes returned to his office on the top floor of FBI headquarters with the same quiet resolve that had carried him through the entire journey. Only this time, he knew every eye in the institution was watching his next move. Not because of his title, but because the recent incident had raised a deeper question. Can justice be redefined not by power, but by the courage to correct from within? Malcolm sat down and placed a well-prepared folder in front of him. Justice Integrity Initiative. Not a PR campaign, not a polished slogan, but a concrete action plan. reform law enforcement training nationwide, with a focus on racial awareness, de-escalation skills, and behavioral self-assessment. Establish an independent civilian complaint unit, bypassing local police departments. Mandate the storage and public release of all body cam footage except in cases involving national security. Hold monthly community dialogues between officers and residents right in the neighborhoods where conflicts had previously erupted. He knew there would be pushback. There would be whispers in the halls, too idealistic, too complicated, unrealistic. But for him, this was no longer a choice. It was a responsibility, not just because he was the director of the FBI, but because he had personally lived through what the system had long denied. On a Monday morning, Malcolm stood before the regional directors from all 50 states in a private meeting room. No flashy decorations, no LED ticker, just a whiteboard, a dry erase marker, and a man who had once been handcuffed not for wrongdoing, but for being himself. He spoke plainly. "I'm not asking you to believe in this initiative right away. I'm asking only one thing. Don't make anyone out there prove their worth just because of the color of their skin or the way they calmly respond to injustice. We cannot ask the public to believe in justice if we still choose who gets protected." The room was silent after that. No applause. But a few gazes had changed, and for Malcolm, that was enough. A few weeks later, during an internal training session in Louisiana, a young officer fresh out of the academy asked his instructor, "Who came up with this program?" The instructor replied, "The director of the FBI." The young officer paused, then said quietly, "If someone who was humiliated by this system still chooses to stay and fix it, then I can at least choose to do what's right." At the top floor of FBI headquarters, Malcolm Hayes wrote the final lines of an internal report addressed to the Attorney General. Before closing the file, he added a handwritten sentence. "Justice should not depend on who you are. It should come because of what happened." No signature, just a reminder for whoever reads it to the end, that a badge may change a person, but only action changes the system. Malcolm Hayes didn't ask for privilege. He only asked to be treated fairly like any other citizen. But his story revealed a chilling truth. Justice sometimes still discriminates. It comes to those with power and overlooks those without a voice. So the most frightening thing wasn't the handcuffs around his wrists. It was the silence of an entire system. If he hadn't held the title of FBI director that day. This story isn't meant to make you angry. It's meant to remind you, justice doesn't begin with a badge. It begins with action from those brave enough to stand up for what's right. If you believe that truth deserves to be told, if you've ever felt dismissed because of your appearance, your background, or a silence forced upon you, leave a comment, share your thoughts, and hit like, subscribe to the channel, so we can continue telling the stories that no one should ever have to live through.